7 or 8, I started putting plastic model rockets together, which was kind of unusual for a girl back in the early 50s. Parents encouraged by giving me gifts of a plastic model rocket. We didn't have the opportunity to have rocket clubs in those days. We did, I'd have joined them for sure. Parents were always really, really eager to have both my sister and me. We both had very supportive parents. They really wanted us to do things that would give us a skill set in life that wouldn't necessarily be what girls normally had. I think everybody needs to have more than one idea of what they want to do. I think the idea of having them all dovetail takes a bit more creativity. So he said to me, he says, you have to have that piece of paper. Do you know that I got every ready piece of paper I could get? But I've got more degrees than most people, and I am proud of every one of them. You have to get used to that view. You have to get used to the things that are upside down, because you're upside down for the most part, and you're floating in every angle all the time. You yourself become your own little spaceship inside a spaceship. I wanted to pick a species that was a good indication of habitat in each of the two hemispheres. And then the other factor for me was I wanted to be able to photograph them in their habitat from the air.
The year was 1969. I was a month shy of my 9th birthday. It was way past my bedtime, though it was only 10 p.m. In my foggy memory of the event, it was the middle of the night, and along with my parents and siblings, we all gathered around the black and white television in my parents' bedroom watching the broadcast of the Apollo 11 moon landing. At 10:56 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, we witnessed, along with the rest of the world, a grainy, grayscale image of Neil Armstrong stepping onto the lunar surface and say, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Neil left out a single syllable word, A. He had meant to say, "That's one small step for a man," that man being him. Still, it didn't matter to anyone watching or listening at the time. The universe had changed. Humans from Earth had stepped foot on another world. Thousands of kids at the time wanted to become astronauts and join the space program. I wasn't one of them. Yes, I loved all things space, watched Star Trek, and followed NASA's every launch. I remember Skylab and Mir, the Space Shuttle, and Hubble. I geek out on videos from the International Space Station and have followed the Artemis program for years. Finally seeing Artemis 2 launch, orbit the moon, and splash down safely this April, nearly 55 years after Apollo 17 splashed down in December of 1972, ending moon missions for over half a century. My life took a different path in 1969, having watched the Miracle Mets win the World Series and see them celebrate on the field on that same black and white television in my parents' bedroom a couple of months later. I chose to pursue a life that would get me on the field at some nebulous future date when a team I was involved with won a World Series. I made it to that childhood future in October 1992 when I ran onto the field with the Toronto Blue Jays when they won their first World Series. Today's guest, on the other hand, did everything in her power to become an astronaut, and earlier that same year flew on the Space Shuttle Discovery mission STS-42 as the first neurologist and Canadian woman in space. I even crossed paths with Roberta Bondar when she threw out the first pitch at a Toronto Blue Jays baseball game after her shuttle flight. Two people from very different walks of life with two very different goals take different paths and end up in the same place all those years later. But it didn't end there. In 2022, when I was up in Sault Ste. Marie, I discovered that Dr. Bondar was born there, and they had celebrated her space shuttle mission with a flower garden built into a scale model of the Space Shuttle Discovery. You must see it sometime, I think. The following year, I heard she was giving a talk about her new book, A Space for Birds, and I knew I had to go. This time it was birds, not blue jays, that brought us back into the same space. After the talk, I spoke to her agent, and we made arrangements for this very podcast. I've come a long way from that kid who loved space but wanted to live a childhood dream of winning a World Series, and Dr. Bondar has traveled to exactly where she wanted to be, to fly in space. Each of us, in different ways, didn't just wish and hope for these things to happen. We focused our lives and energies towards our goals. My mother used to say, if wishes were horses, we would all ride. That was an important lesson to learn as a kid. Don't wish, do. In an era when young people think that manifesting a dream will just make it happen, the people who are successful at achieving their goals, like Dr. Bondar, put in all the hard work. Me, I just got lucky. Stop the presses! In a wonderful bit of serendipity, just days before having Dr. Bondar on the podcast to talk about whooping cranes, an actual whooping crane showed up in northern Ontario. The next morning, I hopped in the car and drove 6 hours north to the small town of Bruce Mines, and along with a who's who of Ontario birders, we waited until sunset for this intrepid young female. She was born of wild parents at the International Crane Foundation in Wisconsin. After being released, Sinclair, yes, they get names and band codes, she joined a group of adults who migrated to Florida for the winter. Her spring migration home to Wisconsin went slightly off course, and she has joined a flock of sandhill cranes in northern Ontario. Let's hope she can make her way home after resting here for a bit. And I was lucky enough to share the experience with many of my birding friends who also made the trek to see this intrepid traveler who will hopefully contribute to the future of this endangered species. So as I sit here in Gilkison Flats at home here in Brantford, listening to songbirds, join me along with Dr. Roberta Bondar as I live my lifelong dream to talk to a real live astronaut about space, birds, and a space for birds. I also wanted to find out a little bit about your journey to wildlife conservation and especially these two species of birds. I've been several places to see the whooping cranes. I've been to wood buffalo. I've been to Saskatchewan. I've been to Aransas, Texas. So when I saw that that was one of the birds you were keenly interested in, that really sparked my interest. You had a dream of becoming an astronaut or a dream of becoming a doctor or
All of it. I think everybody needs to have more than one idea of what they want to do. I think the idea of having them all dovetail takes a bit more creativity.
Mhm.
And it takes a bit more, I'd say, sustenance and sustainability. It's the kind of thing that stems from being curious and having support systems that keep you propelled to follow a certain track. And it's not easy to do these things. It's a lot easier to fall away from it. But then one decides that that's not really what I wanted to do, and then sometimes for people it's too late. So I was fortunate enough to have a lot of discipline and a lot of focus. That plus the curiosity has driven me to where I am today, for sure.
When did you decide you were going to be an astronaut, and how did you prepare for that?
Well, when I was about 8, I think, 7 or 8, I started putting plastic model rockets together, which was kind of unusual for a girl back in the early 50s in a city like Sault Ste. Marie. It was something that my parents encouraged by giving me gifts every holiday season or on a birthday of a plastic model rocket. We didn't have the opportunity to have rocket clubs in those days. If we did, I'd have joined them for sure. The idea that a little girl could have mechano sets. I mean, my parents were always really, really eager to have both my sister and me. My sister's 15 months older than me. A bit of a role model when I was growing up because she was always on the prow of the ship and I was kind of the first mate. But she was doing nights. She would put together nights and tall ships with the plastic kits. We both had very supportive parents, obviously the same parents, but they really wanted us to do things that would give us a skill set in life that wouldn't necessarily be what girls normally had. So my mother would say, Ed, this toaster needs a new plug. Be sure that the girls know how to do it too. So we trundled down to the lower level to Dad's workshop, and he would teach us about wiring, and that's how we lived. We didn't think anything of it. So they would give us mechano sets for Christmas, and so we had the opportunity to have fine hand coordination, and it was just part of our upbringing. We joined Girl Guides. My mother was a Tawny Owl Brownies. That's how we started. So we had a safety net of other girls when we were growing up, so we could make mistakes and not feel silly. We could develop ourselves as leaders in a local family. Why? It wasn't all about boys. It wasn't all about girls. It was just all about being a person. Volunteer work. So it was a very well-rounded. But we did have this penchant for learning skill sets that I think most girls in the city didn't have because our parents were right there and provided us the opportunity in a non-threatening environment with a safety net. And I think that's the bottom line. We went to the library and got books when we didn't have the answers, when our parents didn't have the answers to things, when we saw birds, didn't know what they were. My dad would build bird houses for swallows. We knew the difference between a swallow and a sparrow. Mm-hmm. And then that led to having bird books. And it was part of it. It was just part of who we were. I remember getting my first microscope and always having it around with me, or my first Viewmaster reels, and always having my Viewmaster kit with me, always having my little first aid kit in the car. And so it was a combination of all of it all the time, everywhere, all at once.
So birding goes way back to the beginning too. So you've kept that throughout your entire life.
I would say that flight has been a big part of my life. Yeah.
You flew jets before you became an astronaut?
Well, you raise a very ticklish point with me. Back in the day, women were not allowed in the armed forces. It was very difficult for women to fly. So my uncle was a private pilot, and I think he had his commercial rating as well. But he took me up for my first time in a small Cessna, and I remember he flew a tri-pacer down in Mexico with a couple of his buddies who just got their licenses. But anyway, he took me up, and I really wanted to fly, but there was no way that I had any money. We didn't have money in my family. I never knew we didn't have money. We just did stuff. We went tenting. We didn't have a cottage. We just had a silk tent left over from World War II, and we went down to the States in Wisconsin because the highway wasn't even finished being paved to Toronto. So we just we did what we did, and so the flying part, I was able to get my license afterwards. There's a myth going around that I got my pilot's license for my driving license in a car, and I went like, well, how did they think I got to the airport? No, I was wrong. I got I was in third year university before I got my pilot's license, before I soloed. And it was something I had wanted to do. And in the Sioux, you could get your float rating first. You could get your land rating. I picked the land first because I thought it was a little bit more precise to land. I figured, well, you could get my float rating later. But I wanted to learn to land on the ground first. So all of it happened when I was able to work at the insect laboratory in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. That's really where I first started making a little bit of money to save for university and save for flying. And so it got me back to where I wanted to be, doing a lot of field work. And I worked at the insect lab in the city. For the federal government, I was working on spruce budworm and genetics, and I worked there for 6 summers. I was able to do this field work and learn a lot about biology. I was studying biology at the University of Guelph, and everything came together. It was a field application of my studies, and it was just nice being out in the field. And so I got to be with birds, I got to be with animals, I got to be with insects, and it's just a very well-rounded education that I was being paid for as well.
That does set you up for success, doesn't it? How did you end up in NASA?
This was an extension of wanting to be a spaceman when I had all these plastic model rockets. I never gave that up. I had an aunt who, she and her family moved from New York to Florida when my uncle, who was a Marine, he was American. And so my aunt was my dad's only sister. And so when they moved to Florida, she got a job as an executive assistant at it's been called the Vehicle Assembly Building or the Vertical Assembly Building, the VAB, where the big rockets are stacked. And so she was there during the Apollo, Gemini, Mercury days. And she'd send me posters and patches, and I'd have them plastered all over my bedroom, amongst other things. But I had them, and it just kept my interest up in the space program. I visited them in Florida, and I remember it was just, we were able to see rockets go off at the Cape because they lived in Titusville, not that far away across the Banana River. And I just felt a part of the space program. I never thought in those days about men versus women going up in the space. I just thought it was just human beings. So I really kept in very, very close touch. And then I remember when I was younger, Echo 1 flying over the house. It was a reflecting balloon. It was the first attempt at some communications that they had from Earth, and I just remember all of it. I remember the Apollo 11 landing on the moon. I just in those days I'm going to do this someday. But of course, Canada had a very small space program. I mean, they had a great space science program, and we had these sounding rockets that were being fired off from Churchill, Manitoba. But we didn't have a human spaceflight program. So then when there were no women in the program until the space shuttle era, when we had the original women astronauts in the States, the group of 6. And so it wasn't until they came along and women were accepted. I think people had to remember that women were not allowed in the armed forces. You had to have a job as a commercial pilot in the States as a woman to fly. And in Canada, it was just really, really tough to get those hours. That's all you'd be doing. So for a woman who was also interested in science, it was almost impossible to get the number of hours in a left-hand seat to fly commercially. So I always wanted, I kept in the back of my mind, I thought, well, they'll always need doctors. Whatever they do in space, they're going to need doctors. And I stayed in Canada. I didn't go to the States except for the last part of my training. And it just coincided with the first landing of the space shuttle. Bob and John Crippen flew, and they landed in Florida. I was in the neuro-ophthalmology clinic in Boston in one of my training years. And I just made an excuse to go down and watch this thing land. And I just said to myself, I'm going on that thing. And I didn't say the thing. I said the space shuttle. It was something I really wanted to do, and I had planned on doing it. So when it was announced on the radio and the paper back in '83, boy, I'm old enough to say that. Back in '83, I sound like I was a gold miner. Back in '83, when it was announced, I think I was probably the second application into Ottawa. I think it was after a grandmother who also applied. And that was something I felt I wanted to do. I had all the qualifications. I was really overqualified. And I thought, hey, I'm going to apply to do this. And at the time, I thought I was applying for the space vision experiment because I had 18 years of university. I had everything going. I was a pilot. I had all this medical stuff, the research stuff. And I thought, well, I'll do the space vision experiment, not realizing it was actually the engineering component. And it was all this crazy motion sickness stuff. I was like, oh, really? But anyway, anything to get in. And that's really how I started. It was keeping it in the back of my mind all the time, keeping parallel tracks, keeping the aviation medicine up. I became a medical examiner for pilots as well. But I just finished, actually. I'd just been on staff at McMaster, I think probably less than a year when this opportunity came up. So I was in a good position. I didn't have graduate students. I didn't have a lot of things tying me down. I was ready to go.
From the point of view of people who dream of things but say, but I could never do it. In your mind, it was, I'm dreaming of things and I'm going to do whatever it takes to get there. That's a lesson that a lot of young people need to realize, is that you can dream big, but you have to do all the work to get there.
Yeah, it's work and sacrifice. I think there's a lot that goes into that formula. I mean, I'm not one that's going to say you can be whatever you dream, because I don't believe that's true. I mean, I do believe that there's some reality in life, and a lot of it involves assessing risk. It involves looking at what the pros and cons are, what you sacrifice for doing certain things. And when a person's young, as you know, I mean, you and I have been young. Well, you're younger than me right now, but we've been at a point in our lives where some decision we've made later on in life, you're thinking, well, I'm not sure I'd make it quite like that again, or I'd assess the risk differently, or I can see what happened to me emotionally because I did X, Y, or Z, or whatever. But you can't second guess them. You make them with the best judgment you have at the time. But the idea is you have to make the best judgment, and that involves support systems. And I firmly believe that sometimes you have to have people around you that have tough love.
Yeah.
They basically say, well, you really don't have the finances to do that right now, but there are ways you can get there.
Right.
To offer you this the second. When I was doing this, I thought, my dad said to me many, many years ago, because he was conscripted. I mean, like a lot of young men were in World War II, and he lost 4 years of his life, and the government didn't really care. After they booted them out if they had fewer than 6 years in the armed forces. They had no compensation, and so he wanted to be a chartered accountant. He was shy one subject because at high school in those days they didn't have that subject, but they wouldn't allow him to go and get this course anywhere, so he couldn't be a chartered accountant. And there was no compensation for those 4 years, and he had just married and had a child, and it was terrible. When I look back at the correspondence back in those days, it was nothing, and he had no choice but to be in. And he didn't like war, but he had no choice, and he served his country. But there was nothing afterwards. He lost 4 years of his life, 4 years of income, 4 years of everything. And so he said to me, he says, you have to have that piece of paper. Do you know that I got every ready piece of paper I could get? I've got more degrees than most people, and I am proud of every one of them. And I just remember Dad coming home one time, and he didn't get this promotion because he didn't have whatever. And he says, there were almost tears in his eyes. He says, you have to have that piece of paper. And right from that moment, I thought, I'll get them, Dad. Don't worry.
You won't just get one, you'll get them all.
I got them all. And I did that. And as a woman, it was hard. It was very, very hard. And it was, every one of them was hard. And it was harder than it needed to be. And I thought, if I'm ever in a position where I can make it easier for anybody that has a hard way to go, I will do my best. And it's not necessarily because of gender. It could be because of race. It could be because of the timing. But I'm not going to let somebody else bully someone into not, or intimidate somebody, and they would get the same chance, because that's not right. It's not fair.
Mm-hmm.
And I was brought up to be a fair-minded person and to act accordingly. And so, yeah, I went to university and took a lot of risk. I worked 3 jobs just to get through, but I knew what I had to do. And I did it. And sometimes it was, someone said to me once, did you see X movie or Y movie? And I went, no, I didn't. What the heck were you doing? And I thought, well, I was going to school. I was working 3 jobs. That's why I didn't know what all the music was in the 1970s or it's just like, so I can hear it now, but I didn't. And I'd say to people, they'd say to me, why are you doing this? And I said, well, because at the end of 4 years, I will have my bachelor's degree, or I will have my PhD, or I will have a medical degree, or I will have whatever. And I said, what will you have? You will have something you'll be very happy with, I'm sure. But I said, I'll be able to have this and do then what I want. And I said, I'll give it up 4 years. This is what I'm going to have to show for it. And I only say that when I'm annoyed with that person.
Mm-hmm.
I don't often say it. But if they get me really irritated, that's what I'll turn around and say. For kids who say, well, 4 years of university, I'll look at them and say, I know that you consider people like me a role model, but you're your own role model. And 4 years is not going to be very long. It's going to go by very, very quickly. And you can have fun during those 4 years. Mm-hmm. And you can grow and learn things. I said, what do you think you do? You're going to go in a box for 4 years? You're not. I said, you have a life to live. It's part of your living. People don't realize it. They see barricades and they don't see that that's not what it is. And so anyway, I'll get off my soapbox, but you asked me the question and that's the long answer.
I had a very different path because, well, I didn't know it at the time because I wasn't diagnosed as a kid that I had OCD and ADHD. So sitting in classrooms was, at that time, they didn't do anything about kids like me. So I just created goals in my head, and whatever it took to get to those, I did them. In 1969, I was in the dark in my parents' bedroom with all my siblings watching the moon landing, and that was a big moment in my life. I've just always been interested in the space program. But weirdly, that September, my brother was a Baltimore Orioles fan, and we were watching the World Series when the New York Mets beat the Baltimore Orioles, the Miracle Mets. And when they won the World Series, they all piled onto the field and had this amazing celebration. And I'm a 9-year-old watching this thinking, I want to do that someday. Now, I could have wanted to be an astronaut watching the moon landing, but I created an entire career so that I would have a job with the Blue Jays, so that in 1992, when they won the World Series, I would be able to go on the field and join in that celebration. So something just stuck in my brain. I just did it, and I did whatever it took to get there. So I understand that. Well, I did go to film and television school, so because I was the video coordinator for the Blue Jays for 40 years. So I did those things. I can see how if you get things in your brain and you just don't think, oh, that seems like an impossible thing, but you just do the things in sequential order in the steps like you did, it ends up getting you to where you want to be. I find that very exciting that there's so many different paths, but it always starts with having a very focused goal of what you see yourself as.
Well, that's interesting. We could have met years ago, because in 1992, of course, that was my flight year, but I also threw the opening pitch for the beginning of the season for the Blue Jays that year.
We probably crossed paths that year. It's funny, all the different people who threw out first pitches when I was there, it was never this actors and actresses and singers and celebrities. It were people who had accomplished something, learning about astronauts and educators and physicists. Those were the kind of role models that I always made my life more interesting interesting. And if you can keep educating yourself your entire life, you're always going to find excitement in your life and learn new things. And that's how I live my life.
Absolutely. It's a very good.
Now, this is called the Big Year Podcast, and I talk about birders who do big years around North America. But your big year must have been the year that you got accepted into the space shuttle program and started to train as an astronaut.
That was one of them. I think probably a big year would be 92 when I actually flew.
Mm-hmm.
Came back alive. Probably the biggest year was the year I was born. I mean, a big year would be the year that I graduated from medicine, or any of my graduations. I mean, I think like a lot of people, as we get older, we look back and there are milestones that we've had. But when I like to think about birds, I mean, I saw that movie. See the poster behind you. I've seen that movie so many times. It's interesting, that Big Year movie. When I first saw it, they had John Cleese was doing the voiceover,
Mm-hmm.
but the American version has Black doing it.
Yes, there's two versions.
Yeah.
I've watched both of them many times.
Yeah. I like John Cleese better, but
I watched the John Cleese version more than the other one. It was Sandy Comito, who was my mentor right from the very beginning. We talked a lot, and he gave me lots of advice. He sent me one of his books, and when I started this podcast, he was the first guest that I had.
Oh, it's great. Yeah.
And that's how my brain works. Is like, I see a movie, I have no interest in birding other than I've always been a photographer. So I took a lot of pictures and I spent a lot of time in Florida like you did, but I had no idea what the names of all these birds were. And Sue, she's a birder, but I didn't want to go out birding with her. And then I see this movie and gave me a reason to want a bird, because it was like, oh, there's goals, there's lists, there's travel, and I became an obsessive birder from that point on. I saw birds from the ground, and you've seen the planet from above. And how did that change your perspective?
It's a deep question for sure. Seeing the Earth from, we all have a different view of this. Everybody, I think if you spoke to a dozen astronauts, you get a dozen different ways of looking at it, depending on how long it's been between the time they've seen the Earth or how many times they've seen it. The space station itself has provided a lot more ability for astronauts to actually look at the Earth, because certainly back in the space shuttle, unless you were up at the flight deck a lot, for me, I was quite constrained because the space lab only had one small window. And if it wasn't for the commander who actually forced me up on the flight deck to look at the Earth, it would be very, very hard. We had a tremendous amount of work to do, and you're a third less efficient up there, so it's really tough. It's very, very tough to work in that type of environment. But looking at the Earth, it's hard to look away from the planet. People keep saying, "Oh, what did Mars look like?" Well, we're not a lot closer, for crying out loud. I mean, Mars is like millions of miles away. We're like 300 kilometers higher. We don't have the atmosphere to wiggle through or wiggle our vision through, but the light, the stars don't twinkle. I think that's sort of one of the main things. And so you're surrounded by this, what I call light-sucking black. And so this fathomless black is not what you want to look at. It's a very chilling thing. The Earth itself is bathed in sunlight, and all the water reflects the sunlight back. And so the blue of the oceans, especially around the Caribbean or around some of the atolls in the Pacific, the turquoise that comes back to the eye is very, very pleasing, and you kind of know what it's like down on the Earth around those areas. But the patterns from space are totally different. It looks like a map that I'm sure that you'd see when you're studying in grade 10 or whatever. The edges look, because all the atlases are based now on satellite imagery from looking straight down. But in space, you're not looking straight down. Most of the time, you're looking at an angle. You're looking at an oblique view of the planet. So things are distorted from what you would normally see. You have to get used to that view. You have to get used to the things that are upside down, because you're upside down for the most part.
Chris Hadfield talked about that in one of his books, that because you're flying at this weird angle, your brain takes, like you said, takes a while to convert what you are used to seeing the planet.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just the flight path that's different. It's that you're floating, and you're floating in every angle all the time. I mean, unless you're hanging onto something, you're floating, and you're floating irrespective of the flight path of the vehicle you're in. So it doesn't matter what angle the spacecraft is in, you're at a different one. So you yourself become your own little spaceship inside a spaceship. So you're not stable. So your vision, as a physician, I can just tell you, especially as a neurologist, my training is in neuro-ophthalmology, and the idea that you have to be able to put edges together, which is how your visual system works, in a manner that you can comprehend and reconstruct from your memory what things are, is very hard to do in the first 24 hours. After that, when you get used to what the map is that you have seen before, then you can reconstruct it in your head. But it's not something you do consciously. Your brain has to do these things, and the only way around it is to keep looking, keep looking, keep looking. Because if you don't, you'll always be a naive subject to the view you see. And the other thing that confounds it is that your balance system in your head doesn't help you at all, because there's no up or down. And so down here, your feet, we always get used to our feet being down. So in space flight, your feet still feel like they should be down. So you could be upside, your feet could be at any angle, like the spoke of a bicycle wheel. It could be at 37.5 degrees, or it could be at 97.5 degrees, or it could be at 81 degrees. And it's not accurate. I mean, it's something that's changing by the second as you're moving around. But down here on the Earth, you're either vertically or you're lying down. I mean, you're very rarely standing obliquely at an angle. You're either up or you're down. And so your body has to, and your whole balance system has to reconfigure all of that. But this all goes into your vision and what it is you see, you're able to construct in your head. So this has to get sorted out before you can actually be philosophical and look at the Earth. It does require time. I think it requires patience. And a lot of people go up and they have preconceived ideas of either what created the planet or various aspects of their spiritual self. So there's a lot that goes on. And when people go up to these very, very short flights, I'm not talking about the space shuttles flight now that appear short because of people now being able to be up longer because of things we've learned from the space shuttle missions, but people who pop up for a few minutes in Blue Horizon or whatever and come back, they're not the individuals who will have time to gather the planet, in such a manner against the universe beyond, where they can organize the impact of it actually being a planet and thinking about life on the planet. So when you're asking me a few minutes ago about birds, the one thing that struck me tremendously, well, unless you take tape or sound with you into space, you don't hear Earth sounds. I mean, it sounds trite, but you don't hear Earth sounds. You miss bird sounds. You miss all of it. You miss all of nature. Well, coming back from space and not having to have earbuds in or headsets on or something else to artificially give you that, and you feel you're outside again, and you're touching grasses and you're seeing all these different colors that you don't see from space. You don't see the color of grasses from space. You see different hues. You see different patterns that we don't see down here on Earth because the edges are different. So you get used to things. So when you come back, the realization that you're on the planet again, all the saturated colors, becomes another new experience to the brain again. Is rapidly trying to fill in the gaps that you had before, and so it's almost the reverse. So that the bird sounds became when I came back. It wasn't crisper, but it became almost like a different soundtrack. And that was the difference for me, was to see a blue jay, for example, and see the richness of the colors in the feather, knowing full well that they weren't colors that were resident in the feather, but that they were being reflected back from the feather to my eye, and understanding the whole visual pathway. So going into space is one thing to reset not reset, but to set in a direction of the view, and then coming back to Earth, resetting it, but it doesn't get reset immediately to where it was. But it can allow for different moments of introspection about life and about colors and textures and relationships of life forms one to the other. And as a student of biology and ecology that I was, and as also a student of medicine and interactions amongst life forms, I found both going up into space and coming back from space, because I was doing experiments in space medicine, I found both experiences were very rich indeed. And it made me want to focus more on broader aspects of things that I encountered. I was on an international mission, which also made my life as an astronaut much richer than if I had gone just as an individual astronaut to do just Canadian stuff. Mm-hmm. Nothing wrong with being Canadian, but it's better to be within the world that we live in, the way birds are, and that's what I wanted to do.
It's interesting that you talked about that, because almost every astronaut I've ever listened to, they always talk about the experience of seeing the planet. I've never heard anyone talk about coming back to Earth and having an even more open experience and changing the way they see the planet when they're on the planet. That changed your perspective, especially when you talk about birds. You went into your life on Earth, a different perspective on birds, and where did the concept of these two specific birds, the lesser flamingo and the whooping crane, how did those two birds capture your imagination and make you want to research them and work on conservation?
Well, I guess there are probably three things I could speak to. First of all, I wanted to do something internationally, and I consider the whooping crane an international bird, mm-hmm. because if we're speaking internationally, normally people are talking about geopolitical boundaries. Right. So this is a bird that flew across north-south. Mm-hmm. But also the idea of the lesser flamingo, it is a bird that flies willy-nilly in some ways. It goes to different countries depending on the food source. It goes across borders, and it goes places where people have no idea. It's very hard to track this particular bird, and not as easy as is the whooping crane, although there are a lot more of the lesser flamingos. And so I thought, well, that's one reason. And they're both declining. I mean, one is endangered because of the habitat that's a problem currently. That is the whooping crane in terms of its migration corridor and things that are happening with agriculture and wind farms and hurricanes with their food source when they're up in the Northwest Territories and dealing with the crabs in the south. So it was something that I was interested in because of that. And the lesser flamingos are near threatened because Lake Natron is their 85% of the world's population is growing and is really nesting in Lake Natron. And if anything happens to Lake Natron, that's going to wipe out most of the world's population of these wild lesser flamingos. So that was something I wanted to pick a species that was a good indication of habitat in each of the two hemispheres, if we divide the world in eastern and western hemisphere. And then the other factor for me was I wanted to be able to photograph them in their habitat from the air. I wanted to have an intermediate viewpoint between space and the ground. I don't know how many times I've had to tell people you can't see these birds from space.
Right.
And I mean, people look at these, where is flamingo? They're not there. But I wanted the space images, not just because I've been an astronaut looking at the Earth in space, but rather to show how big these corridors are, how far these birds fly, and they don't have engines. You know, they're amazing creatures. So from space, even to see the lesser flamingo, you can't see it all in one shot. You can even take a wide angle, you still can't see it in one shot. And so it was the same with the whooping crane. To see that 4,200 kilometer migratory corridor, you have to see it in frame by frame by frame. And in fact, the space station, either the space station or the shuttle, flies as far north as the whooping crane flies. Like I get up to north of Wood Buffalo. It's just trying to get a shot north of Lake Claire.
I saw that in your book, that it's like at the very edge of what they can photograph from space.
That's right. That's what I wanted to have these space images for, was to just show this tremendous distance of the length and breadth of this immense corridor that these birds fly. So that's why I wanted to do the space part. and also show the terrain is incredible. So once you get to with the whooping crane, show all the agriculture and see how that bird has been pushed away out of its traditional nesting areas, and the history that went behind it. And then with the lesser flamingo, the same. So the aerial photography was very important to me. I'm a very, very responsible. I'm not a photographer that wants to go and get a picture at the expense of a bird.
Right.
I would never do that. In fact, all my work with the whooping cranes always had a person from the Canadian Wildlife Service with me, or Parks Canada, and usually with Parks Canada with an Indigenous, with an elder with me as well, to be able to maintain and hear about the view of and the place of the whooping crane in the traditional history of Indigenous people. I also wanted to show the vast distances that these whooping cranes go to nest. And in the Northwest Territories, there's just 25, 50 kilometers sometimes between nesting, one nesting site to another nesting site. Now, I know I think it was a German gentleman that did a whole book on the nesting sites in the Northwest Territories of this one whooping crane pair that had a set of twins. And it's an incredible book, a wonderful book. I had no intention of landing and going in to photograph a nest. I wasn't going to do that, and so I wanted it just from the air. So being a graduate of a program in landscape and nature photography, I wanted to really bring to bear being an artistic photographer to this. It wasn't just taking snapshots from the helicopter. And as a pilot, I could get the pilot to bank and pitch the helicopter where I wanted to get it. I wanted the helicopters at specific places because of the light. Sometimes there was a bit of wind, we're having to go around and then chase the helicopter back into the place and hope the cranes were still there in the nice where they were, so that we could get the colts or get the lovely patterns of some of these areas of these ponds. So it worked quite well, and some of the ground shots were I just kept going back out, and this was all stuff that I supported personally. With my personal funds. I didn't get funding to do this from anywhere. It was something that I would do in collaboration with Parks Canada in exchange for some of the other things that I was able to do with the Indigenous people. So I'd go on survey flights, for example, and there was a spare seat. And I would do stuff with school kids or for the community at large. So the whooping crane was a no-brainer, and then went over with the lesser flamingo. It was the same kind of thing. I was working with some of the students in Nairobi as well. So it worked out very well, and it just took 12 years basically to accumulate enough images off and on with these birds. Sometimes we'd go into some place, and overnight the wind would be perfect for these birds to leave where I was going to shoot. In Kansas or Oklahoma, and suddenly the birds the next morning they'd be gone because there'd only be like one or two pair. And I'd get the helicopter, and so I'd get them to fly through the windmills so I could get a bird's eye view, sort of, but not really, but just get the flight path through these windmills. And so it just took a long time, and it took a lot of discipline and focus to be able to get these things. And I was shooting with a medium format camera, my camera of choice, from the air, and these are not easy cameras to use and manipulate either. So very, very big images that I was taking, and then I donate them all to the foundation that bears my name, so we could do these traveling exhibitions as well as the book.
When I heard about the one you were doing in Niagara Falls, it was like, I have to go. I didn't even take a second to think about it. It's like, we're going to see Roberta Bondar. And that was an incredible exhibition and very eye-opening. And it was one of the reasons why last fall I wanted to drive to Saskatchewan to see them on their stopover on their way to Aransas. My very first whooping crane was in Aransas, and in 2022 I saw them from Northwest Territories, and I didn't even realize it. I'm in the Northwest Territories, and I drive to the viewing platform that overlooks the salt flats, and when I was there I discovered that I was in Alberta, and so on my Northwest Territories official eBird list I don't have whooping cranes, which is one of the reasons I wanted that bird on my Northwest Territories list, because I was traveling the entire country that year. And when I looked at my eBird list later, and I'm like, I was in Alberta, didn't even feel like I had changed from one province to the other. The fun thing about looking at the pictures in your book is that from that viewing platform, I have a big wide shot and I can see the spot where I saw the whooping cranes from my view, which are very, very small in my photos. I can see that spot from above in your book, which is kind of neat to see a different view from what I was able to see probably half a kilometer away from where the birds were. And the thing I learned over the years of birding was that I can't just tick off birds and move on. I learned very early from a birder named Jean Iron, and one of the first birds I ever saw in January of 2012 was King Eider, and she let me look through her scope, and it was like an amazing experience. And I looked at the bird, and then I was about to walk away, and she said to me, "Aren't you going to stay and study the bird?" And it was like, oh, I was just looking at birds. That really changed my whole perspective till this day. When you were photographing and studying each of these birds, you must have had a really great appreciation for all the little details and all the behaviors of these birds.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot different photographing some kind of a shorebird or a big bird than it is some kind of a perching bird or a passerine. They're a lot harder to study. Cardinals are harder to study than ducks, but either way, I think when people are familiar enough with birds, it's nice to be able to not predict, but it's nice to be able to, in some ways, make friends with them. There's a lady that quite often when I'm down in one of the areas that in the wintertime, I go down and photograph because I'm working on a second book right now. I'm in the middle of writing it, and it's some of the overwintering birds are difficult for a novice to tell one from the other. And people constantly come up to her and ask her, "What is that? What kind of plover is that?" I know it's a plover. And so she just turns and she says, "Well, how do you know it's a plover?" So she makes them tell her why they think it's a plover before she'll tell them what it is. And 9 times out of 10, it's not a plover. But she'll point out what a plover is, and then she'll point out the difference between a snowy plover and a piping plover. And they'll look at them and they say, "Well, never thought of that." And she said, "Well, look at the way they forage. They forage differently." And you can tell them they're trying to sneak away, and she's not going to let them get away until they actually know that they have asked the wrong question, and they will leave knowing they can now ask the right question and know something that they didn't know before, but she will never let them leave. They ask a question like that.
That's fun. 13 years later from when I started birding, I feel like I wasted the first 51 years of my life not appreciating the birds that I was photographing when I was in Florida.
Yeah, don't you? Yeah, you feel like that, don't you? I mean, I must say, when I came back from space, I felt like that. I felt that's a glossy ibis. I just thought it was a black ibis. Glossy ibis. I didn't know they even called them a glossy ibis. Why did they call them a glossy ibis until the sun reflected off? That's a glossy ibis. And it's that, yeah, I listen, I've been there, done that. I understand what you're saying.
It's not always the birds, but it's the places the birds take you to. Places I visited in Canada that I may never have gone specifically because of the birds.
That's right.
Some of the amazing places. I would have never been in Alaska if it wasn't for doing a big year.
Yep, that's right.
The places you've traveled to see these birds, you've been to every stop along the whooping cranes.
That's right.
And the different habitats that they nest in and stage in and winter in, is there a pattern that you saw?
Well, I think that with respect to the whooping crane, when you see most of them together, that's in the staging area in Saskatchewan. I think that's, if a person really wanted to see whooping cranes for sure, that's where they would see them, because there are a lot of families that are still together, a lot of sub-adults that are still together before they branch off. So that's what is referred to as the staging area, as opposed to a stopover area, which is after the staging area, then they branch out. So that's a little bit different, but they always have to have a feeding area and then a roosting area that's not too far away from the feeding area. But there are these different sites that they want. But I think after you leave that site, what my impression on the rest of it is that it's very similar all the way down. When I was photographing from the air, for example, in Aransas and the area around Aransas, because they're not necessarily all in the Aransas National Wildlife Area. They're in the area around
Mhm.
around that area as well. People are giving their farms now to the refuge and to expand it. It's very similar to with buffalo, just in terms of not necessarily that they're a karst system, but that they're these little ponds and just a lot of edges of water. Now, with buffalo, they're not necessarily the same kind of water insects and crustaceans. They're because they have the blue crabs. They're more brackish water down at Aransas. But they're just looking at it in terms of the pattern. They're very similar. There's water. There's edges. There's some kind of substrate that has food source in them. But I find that there are other birds that I've been following that really do change when they get to their nesting areas that are different from their overwintering areas. That in the overwintering areas, for example, just in the piping plover down in Florida, for example, or in Costa Rica, whatever, they're the shore, they're the ocean, they're the tidal areas, intertidal areas, and back in Canada, or even the Great Lakes in the States, or in the prairies, they're freshwater shorelines, and so it's a different food source. They're different. They're so different from where they're what they take up in the overwintering areas are bloodworms down in Florida. So it is different. But for the lesser flamingos, it's similar. I mean, they don't have the snow, they don't have the winter like that. They prefer these ephemeral lakes. They're very much soda lakes because the food that they go after is bacteria, as opposed to the greater flamingo, which has the shrimp and crustaceans, a typical kind of flamingo kind of food that people are used to. The lesser flamingos eat bacteria, so they require a specific kind of water column with these that allow this algae to grow. So they are that is very, very similar along the migration route.
Which is why, as you said, their migration is just anywhere and everywhere as long as there's the right food source.
That's right. And so the whooping cranes are basically an omnivore. They will even eat carrion if they had to. They'll eat berries. Normally, when they get down to Aransas, if the blue crabs aren't around, they'll be eating these berries for the first part, and then they'll go to the crabs. They tend to like. When they nest, they want to be at a very rich in protein food source. I mean, there are a lot of insects and crustaceans and things. And the same with the piping plovers. I mean, they want to be around where there's a good food source for the chicks to survive. So I think food is everything for birds. And so they go to a place. I mean, you look at the Arctic where the red knots fly to, and coming from South America, if they get to Delaware Bay and there are no horseshoe crabs, to lay these very lipid-rich eggs, or out in the West Coast, and if they're grunion, little small fish lay these eggs similarly for another subspecies red knot, they won't do well either. So food is everything, and it changes depending on their migration routes. But for the whooping cranes, they survive quite well because they can change their diet depending. But they still need to have someplace safe, and they need to have good water source. And if they get shot, a couple of years ago, 2 whooping cranes got shot in Kansas or Aransas, not Aransas, Oklahoma or Kansas. Somebody shot them. I mean, they're pretty big birds, and they still get shot even though they're protected. It's still pretty difficult. But they're coming back. But just looking at the migration pathway, I'd say that they know what they're doing. And when agriculture started happening in the prairies, they got pushed out of the prairies pretty quickly. And it wasn't until the early 50s they figured out they're up in the Northwest Territories, and that's where they are, and hopefully that's where they'll be able to continue to breed in the summer.
And that brings me to the subject of climate change. And I was thinking of the expression "a canary in a coal mine," and birds are a really interesting indicator of climate change and how it affects the planet and how it affects the birds.
Yeah, well, yes, it's. I think one of the things that Indigenous people are doing are looking at their sort of the historical record that they have, the verbal record they have of the past, and the kinds of things that they were used to generations ago in terms of bird life, and seeing how that has changed, along with obviously the climate change and the changing in the temperature of the Arctic waters and the permafrost melting, that and the birds and the snow geese, the kinds of birds that they're seeing now that they haven't seen for a while, or woodpeckers now trying to find trees when all of
Mhm.
our hydro poles do to try to peck at because the tree line doesn't have tall trees up there. So I think there are those kinds of things. But again, birds will go where the food is. If the
Mhm.
food's not there, they're not going to go there. But with climate change, birds are affected by many things, not just the food. There's a whole issue of predators. Right now, they go to the Arctic mainly. Many species of birds, including sanderlings, they go to the Arctic to nest because that's where there are very few predators.
Mhm.
So with climate change, predators go where the food is.
Right.
Birds are there, the predators are up there. So you see the shift in predators, you see the shift in parasites, see the shift in all kinds of infectious diseases. And so I think that it's when you see birds shift their habitat, you'll also see other things shift their habitat. And so then birds are going to respond in kind. So I don't think we're over yet the whole business of seeing birds as a species that's responding only to climate change as temperature. It'll be responding to why the temperature has changed, why the temperature is shifting other things.
Mhm.
What people do forget is that the Arctic is not shifting its light cycle, the temperature, but not the light cycle, because the planet, as far as I know, has not shifted its orbit.
Right.
So the light cycle is going to change. So nobody is in a rush to set up a lot of stuff up there. You have to just think that if it gets warmer, you still have to deal with the light and dark. So all these things, it's a complicated ecosystem of the Arctic is fragile because it doesn't take much of a shift, as we've seen with ice melt,
Mhm.
to shift a number of things and shifts the temperature of the Gulf Stream, for example, and that affects the weather, a lot of the temperate climate weather. So we're just sort of monitoring all of this. And I say monitoring, it's not that people are not trying to do something, but
Mhm.
we don't know what to do with the data, first of all. So we
Right.
have to have the data to do something with it. And we're taking baby steps because we haven't been here before. And birds are kind of like, it's not necessarily just one species of bird. Maybe we'll find that there are species of birds that don't want to do this and won't.
Mhm.
And we'll find other species that we wouldn't even think would do this, but they are. And then when we see the herbaceous plants shifting, because the tree line shifts all the time, and the tree line is not just about one tree being here or being there. And the birds, as you said and mentioned, are quite sensitive. But again, it's because of safety and food. I mean, they're not going to go somewhere. They're going to die if there's no food, and they're
Right.
going to die if there's no safety. So we'll see. It's too early to tell.
In Ontario, the winter, we have the winter finch forecast, and it's all about the food sources. And if there's not enough food, then we up north, then we get more finches in southwestern Ontario. And if there's lots of food, we see no finches. So a few years ago, we had evening grosbeaks everywhere in where I am in the Brantford area, and redpolls. And like you said, all about the food source. And how is the space station contributing to that? Because I know you had the ability to get photos that were taken from the space station for your book, and the photos that they take of the planet and the science that goes on. How is that contributing to spotting changes in climate and changes in, like you say, the tree line and the Arctic ice?
The bottom line is that the satellites are contributing a lot, and there are monitors on space station for sure, but the space station doesn't track far enough north, and it's not in a polar orbit, so
Mhm.
it's an east-west orbit. So it only goes up to 56, 55 degrees above the equator and below the equator, and it also isn't at an angle sometimes to take consistent data. Satellites, you can overlap and overlay data all the time, and you have historic data that you can constantly pull. So the space station, I think of it as it's the human view. Satellites you can command to take there are different sensors on it. The space station has some different sensors, but it is the human view. And the human view, unless you really want to cause a lot of people a lot of heartburn, this satellite, you don't really configure them to take the horizon, and you don't really configure them to take pictures of the aurora. And you don't really configure them necessarily to take pictures of a hurricane as it's doing its thing, or typhoons or cyclones.
Right.
So the space station is one where human beings in real time are there and can photograph things. You do have weather satellites, but they tend to be, it takes a little bit to do 3D reconstruction, as good as we are. But certainly from the space station, if the space station is flying over an area of interest, they can take sequential photographs, but these are not data images necessarily.
Right.
They provide the opportunity, I think, for people to make annotations and to make observations that they can then say, we didn't see this, we didn't recognize this before, and let's see if we can't figure out how to get more data from satellite imagery. What sensors do we need, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, to me, that's what the human view is about. The human view is about looking at something and trying to observe something and trying to say, how can we get this data on a consistent basis and sustain data collection and have it reliable? And how can we look at it from different vantage points when we're talking about different types of sensors and different types of spectral frequencies that we can observe, whether it's infrared or ultraviolet or whatever. I also think that the imagery from the space station is great because people have input as to what images can be acquired. So someone will say, hey, you know, we haven't seen what it looks like from whatever. But because satellite imagery is, to me, it does not necessarily tell the whole story.
Right.
Sometimes it's data, but data is not an image. And we're used to how the human visual system will take light and try to interpret it. So I think there's certainly merit in trying to take, and I think too, the space station imagery is a lot cheaper than satellite imagery.
Right.
If you try to get imagery from spot image, for example, it's quite expensive.
One of the things you asked for when getting photos from the space station was to make sure that the horizon and the blackness of space was behind every image. What was your reason for that? What made that special for you?
As I said, satellites, very hard to get that particular view, to get somebody to swing a satellite sensor up to get the edge of the Earth and the universe beyond, because people keep forgetting that we're on a planet, and it's the only way you can recognize it is to see the edge of it. If you don't, how do you know? You look down from the Earth straight down. I mean, yeah, it's a nice glorified, more magnified view of whatever it is you're looking at, but it doesn't really tell you you're on a planet. You need to have that, what you consider as a skewed view, because it's an oblique view. You're looking across at something, and it's so the relationships are so different. But it also gives this blackness. Now, people have said to me, well, how come you don't see stars? Well, it's because the sensor is overpowered by the light reflecting off the surface of the Earth back to our eyes. And so the sensor gets to the dynamic range between light and dark is not good enough on these sensors to be able to take the little light from the stars, dim light, and expose it as well as the light coming off the surface of the planet, which is a lot brighter. So the sky is not exposed properly. There's the blackness. And so you don't see these very, very faint stars. But sometimes you can see it with the videos they do, because the dynamic range of videos are a lot better. With the satellite images, you don't really see the aurora. But if you get the videos from the space station, you see the aurora, you see the stars, you see the night shots of the planet. You have the ability to increase the amount of light that comes into the camera, because the aurora, the planet's dark anyway, and you just have night lights there. It's like the starlight. So you have a much better exposure. So you do see the Earth like a planet at night, much better than during the day. So I was just determined that people see these migratory corridors on the planet as a planet. That it's not just some agricultural field these birds are flying over. Well, that's instructive enough, but you need to see that it's in relationship to a planet.
That's really neat. At this point, what is the conservation status of the whooping crane and the lesser flamingo? I know the whooping crane is making a comeback. What's happening with the lesser flamingo?
Well, the lesser flamingo is still considered near threatened. It's not into the endangered category that the whooping crane is at the moment. The whooping crane needs to get up to 1,000 anyway, and that's kind of hard to do. But the lesser flamingo, again, is just take the wiping out of the Lake Natron to dump it into the next category, which would be the endangered. But right now, they're fairly healthy. There's, I think, well over 1.2 million or something something of, I haven't looked up the figures for 2025 or obviously 2026, but certainly the population is fairly stable right now. There are things that happen now and then to the lesser flamingos, such as floods. There are a couple of these ephemeral lakes up and down the East African Rift Valley that can change their water level, and that changes the food source, so that these lesser flamingos, they may have a tough time with their nests or their young chicks, or something else happens to this food source. Sometimes it's hard for the researchers to really get a handle on how many of these flamingos there are, unless they're back at the nesting season. So I'd say that it's a fluctuating number, but it's certainly, as long as it's over 1 million, I think it'll remain at the near threatened level.
Are there things being done in both Canada and the US to help create more space for the whooping cranes?
I'm not sure if the current administration is going to be shifting any policies at all. But certainly one of the things that that's a real problem is just dealing with hurricanes and damage being done to the shoreline of Aransas National Wildlife Refuge, or that area where whooping cranes depend upon the blue crab as their food source to bulk themselves up to go back north for the nesting season in the spring. Because along the coastal waterway where these birds basically feed, if you get these, some of these big barges that go along also are quite disruptive to the water banks, because they have a lot of waves that are produced by the barges that come down. There's a possibility of oil leakages. There's a number of things that can happen locally as well to the banks, as well as just climate change. So there are things that can be done, and it's there's dredging, and there's a lot of local factors that happen. So they count on things like the bird festivals to really bring a lot of pressure to bear on some of the local politics to be able to keep the banks of these waterway intact. I think that when we look at the rest of the migratory pathway through the breadbasket of the USA, it's very hard to say what you're going to change in there, except that the actual areas whooping crane uses, some of the areas like Cheyenne Bottoms Wildlife Management Area or Cuvera National Wildlife Refuge, that salt plains, is to be able to have people not damage them further, not damage the areas further, and to have education. Wildlife management education is really, really important, so people understand that their impact when they travel to these areas, they need to minimize it, because there's not much you can do. I mean, people could try to change some of the local bylaws for wind farms. But I think one of the great things that's happening is that people are developing better and better ways of monitoring whooping cranes and trying to get some real-time data about what their flight patterns are and the altitudes that they fly and where they fly, and how people can help manage them safely, help manage the habitat that they need for during these migrations. So I think all of that is very important, and the ongoing collaboration between NGOs and government to maintain this international wonderful conservation effort that has gone on for years, and to hopefully maintain it into years to come.
Well, hopefully some young people who are listening to this will maybe be spurred to make a difference in their lives with conservation, and hopefully people who are the young ones now are the people who really make a difference in the future. I think that's something that has to be encouraged, and I think you are doing an amazing job of educating people to want to make a difference in bird conservation and just the planet in general too.
I hope it's been helpful, that this time has been good for you.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for taking the time. It's been amazing. A thrill for me to talk to you. As I said, ever since 1969, the space program has been always something I've been excited about. I just can't wait for Artemis to launch. I hope you keep doing good work. What's the next book you're working on?
I'm looking at some shorebirds that are smaller. Let's put it that way.
You were talking very excitedly about plovers.
They'll be in there.
this podcast, talking to birders across North America, has been such an education for me, and I thank you very much for contributing. Thank you.
Pleasure.
I have pictures of your space shuttle flower garden in Sault Ste. Marie that I've taken when I've been there. 2022, that's when I was thinking how much it would mean to me to be able to talk to you about your love of birds and birding. Well, thank you.
Okay, well, good luck. Nice chatting with you, Robert.
Nice talking
Take
to
good
you.
care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, that was a lot of fun, and I learned a lot. I hope you did too. But boy, at the end, I was doing a serious fanboy geek out, I think. Once again, thank you for listening to me, and you'll hear me next month, but I don't know what you're going to hear. I have some guests lined up. I don't know who's going to be featured, and May is a busy month with migration, so you might expect a delay with the Big Year podcast to mid-June, but we'll see how migration goes. I'm sure you're going to all be out and migrating to all the famous migration hotspots. Spring migration is what we all live for. And the rarities like the whooping crane. And the good news is our whooping crane Sinclair has, since I first reported it, moved on from Ontario and is hopefully on her way to Wisconsin to find a mate and procreate and help build the numbers of this endangered and wonderful species. Until next time, good day, good birding, and have a great migration season. And if you're a Big Year birder and listening to this, please get in touch because I would like to have you on a future episode of the Big Year podcast. Neil left out a syllable. I chose to pursue a life that would get me on the field at some nebulous first. And they'd sell it when I in 2022 when I was up in Sault Ste. Marie. Don't say salt. Days before Dr. Bondar put, oh my goodness, podcast, not, and after being released, Sinclair, and the rarities, like the whooping, boy, at the end, was I doing a good fanboy job.